Welcome back, my friends, to another long, gentle journey through time here on Boring Historian Sleepy, the place where history unfolds in slow and soothing detail until your eyelids grow heavy and your mind drifts away into peaceful rest. And before we begin tonight's tale, I want to thank you for being here, for taking this quiet moment to share a story with me. And if you enjoy these soft wanderings through the past, I invite you to subscribe so you can join me again for many more nights of gentle history, each one carefully crafted to help you drift away while exploring worlds long gone. And now that you are comfortable, perhaps with the light low and the day's noise fading from your mind, we can step together into another time, another place, another world entirely. A world that begins with the sound of distant waves breaking against a cold stone shore and the faint murmur of voices you cannot yet understand. And as you turn your head, you realize the smell of the air is wrong, heavier somehow, laced with smoke and salt. And when you look down, you see your hands are not quite your own, the skin roughened, the nails rimmed with dirt, the sleeves of your coat frayed at the edges, and you take a step forward into the thin fog curling around your boots. Not knowing yet that you have woken not in your own time, not in your own life, but in the year 1942, in a Europe gripped by war. It began with a sound that was not a storm nor the distant growl of traffic, but a high, keening wail that threaded itself through the air and pressed against your ribs until you could taste metal at the back of your throat. And when your eyes opened, the world was not the familiar ceiling of your bedroom with the soft glow of a phone screen, but a low, curved roof of corrugated iron and the close, confining smell of damp earth and coal smoke, and for a moment just a single disorienting gasp, because the light that finds its way through the seams is thin and orange, as if the whole city were lit by furnace glow, and then a dull concussion shudders the shelter, and you realize with a lurch that you are not dreaming at all, but somewhere that has a timetable measured in sirens and shrapnel. Your hands, when you lift them to your face, are rough and smelled of soap you do not recognize, and in your lap there is a small, round tin labeled with a name you have never owned and yet somehow feels familiar. Your fingers close around the strap of a gas mask. Box, canvas, frayed at the edges, the leather handle cold and stiff, and the clothes that cling to your shoulders are not the soft hoodie you remember from last night, but a heavy dark coat buttoned high against an invisible wind, the collar damp with condensation, and a battered identity card peeks out of your breast pocket like a thin, accusing window into another life. As you push back the flaps of the shelter, the air that hits you is raw and hot, at once a contradiction of smells tar and burnt wood, the metallic temps of explosives, coal smoke curling with the sweeter scent of hot soup, and, when you crawl out into the garden above you, the sky is a bruise of smoke and falling ash searchlights stabbing jagged white fingers through the haze, as if trying to find something they had once loved and lost. And beyond the row of terraced roofs, a column of fire trails like a second sunrise, where incendiary bombs have found their mark and set a house alight so that flaming shingles fall like rain. Neighbors move in a kind of rehearsed half-darkness, faces pale under soot, children clutched to chests with hair matted from sleep, and the woman who opens her door to take in fresh air, her hair wrapped in a scarf, her mouth pressed around a cigarette she does not want to finish, looks at you with an expression that registers you as both stranger and fellow sufferer, and says, in a voice frayed by little sleep, "You all right, love? Where did you come from?" And you find you cannot answer in the small, modern sentences you would have used at breakfast. Your tongue forms older shapes, as if language itself has been rewired overnight, and you instead only gesture at your chest where the gas mask box is feeling suddenly ridiculous and exposed. A whistle slides across the sky and someone claps their hands twice, the household signal to hurry, and you are shepherded down into the cellar of the house, pressed close to bare brick, and the faint, rhythmic thrum of an anti-aircraft battery somewhere beyond the river, and below ground the world is a different economy. Slippers swapped for boots, candles, passed like contraband, a small transistor, radio its case dented, its dial sticky buried under newspapers that are thicker with advice than print, and when the voice crackles through the static, it speaks in clipped serious tones, about blackout regulations and ration card allocations, and the need to keep calm, words that cling to the damp air like soot. You watch a child press his cheek to a woman's sleeve, and a man with a wartime mustache one side flecked with ash tuck, his ration book close to his heart as if it were a talisman, and you notice small details that anchor you with a sharpened clarity. The chipped enamel mug beside a tin of condensed milk, the way everyone's hands move with a practiced economy, folding blankets, pouring tea from a thermos into paper cups that steamed, the slow ritual of making safety from scarcity, and every glance exchanged between neighbors is a sentenceless history of who has been lost and who survives by a thread. Outside, the city makes its unpleasant music, the distant thump of high explosive, the bright popping of incendiary devices, the low, machine-like bark of searchlights sweeping like the palms of enormous hands. And when a report cracks closer than the others, the house above shudders and someone murmurs a prayer you cannot place and yet recognize by cadence, while down here an old woman with a face like creased leather opens a tin and hands you a square of bread that tastes of rationed flour and purpose, and the act of eating anchors you in a way that no assurances could. A man who introduces himself as Marcus, his accent smooth, with miles of commute and another kind of patience sits opposite you. His hands big around a mug, and he tells you without looking up that the worst nights have a way of going on past the small hours, and that the ladder into the street will creak when asked to take you back up, which is both literal and something you understand as an instruction for how to carry yourself. And when you ask him what year it is, he gives you a look that accepts the question as reasonable and replies simply, 1940, keep your head down and don't mention you're from nowhere. You realize with a sudden, dizzying vertigo that your phone, the thin rectangle that tethered you to your life, is gone. No glowing screen, no notifications that will undo this. Only the in-the-hand weight of a paper ration card and an identity tag and a small, circular coin for the gas meter objects that insist you live by rules with which your modern fingers are not fluent. And somewhere in the corner of the cellar a man plays a low tune on a battered harmonica that sounds like a map of better days folded into single notes. The household elders debate in low voices about whether the raid is a feint, whether the factory on the far side of the river is being targeted for munitions or for morale, and as they speak the youngest no more than 18 bends to tuck an extra blanket around an old lady whose breath rattles like a cartwheel, and you notice that bravery here is not the heroic rush you pictured in cinema, but a series of small, exacting kindnesses sewn together against the cold. At one point the cellar door creaks and someone climbs down carrying a child wrapped in a sack, hair singed, but eyes wide and uncomprehending, and the room takes on a hush so complete you could hear a spoon drop through the floorboards, and in that hush a voice murmurs a name, Elsie, and for a beat you feel something like recognition, as if a loop in time has been closed, and then the identity slips away again beneath the noise, because here names are knots that tether past to present, and someone else's memory is your only map. When the all-clear is uncertain and the siren's wail becomes an intermittent animal, you climb back up into a street that is less a place than a tableau of absence, windows blown in, curtains hanging like flags at half-mast, a bicycle idle against a lamppost with one wheel bent, and a scattering of soot where neighbors used to stand with their shoes by the door. Small, mundane things become proof that lives were once full of ordinary motions, and you find yourself cataloguing them as if to prove to some inner tribunal that you are not the only thing dislocated. On the pavement a group of men gather around a charred bicycle, and one his hair pricked white at the temples jokes, in a voice that is mostly bravado, about how the council will never see the state of this road now, and the joke cracks enough to let out a laugh that tastes of something like relief. And while you stand there, a young woman with an oil-streaked face offers you a cigarette, and when you refuse, she smiles with the tired generosity of someone who has practiced making new strangers into allies. A little further down, where the street widens into a crescent, a ruined shopfront has become a stage for quiet barter, the exchange of preserved fruit for a length of cloth, the swapping of a child's toy for a bottle of tonic. And you notice the old painted shop sign half hanging, the letters curling like dried vines, and imagine the stories that once nested there. Weddings announced quarrels, patched small triumphs recorded in ledger ink that now lies beneath a fine layer of dust. In the air overhead the searchlights have multiplied into a lattice of white traffic, as if the sky itself has become a prison for light, and from the riverside a series of dull explosions mark where the guns have found their target, or been found in turn, throwing up fountains of mud and water that glitter like a field of gunmetal flowers before collapsing back into the river's hungry mouth. And you sense in every shudder the scale of what the city is bearing. An engine of civilian life running against a blade, and you feel the strange, bitter kinship of being one small beat inside that huge, trembling heart. At dusk, the household organizes a rota for watch, a small list written on the back of an envelope, with names that are less like labels and more like pledges. And you are given a task that seems absurd in its simplicities. Weep the hearth, count the cup spot. You accept it because motion anesthetizes worry. And as you do, the woman who first saw you press a folded photograph into your hand, the edges soft from handling, and the photo shows a shoreline and a boy with a kite and the single most ordinary smile you have ever seen, and for a moment, you are assaulted by the sense that this could be your memory too, if you only had the courage to claim it. Night comes with a different gravity. The city contracts into a collection of breathing rooms and hearths. Candlelight trembling behind blackout curtains, the distant flashes slowed into a deceptive rhythm, and when you lie awake on a narrow cot in the front room, the muffled thunder of anti-aircraft guns becomes the new lullaby, irregular and insistent, and you count not sheep but the names you have heard this evening, as though keeping them in mind will stitch you into this time and place. Before sleep finally takes you, if sleep it is, for it will be a thin, wary thing, you tuck the gas mask tin under your pillow and the ration book under your arm like a child's secret. And the last thought that crosses your mind is not of how to get home, but of how to remain present in the moment you have been thrust into, to learn the cadence of the city's alarms, the map of its blackouts, the soft, necessary courtesies that pass for heroism here, because history, you understand in a sudden, granular clarity, is not only made by generals and banners, but by the small, exact kindness of sharing a scrap of bread and giving a stranger a cigarette in a street that keeps forgetting itself with every blast. The whistle split the cold morning air like a blade through cloth, and the line surged forward, boots thudding on the duckboards before finding the sucking pull of the mud beyond, the ladders slick under hurried hands, and then you are up and over, the world outside the trench, a sudden and blinding expanse of grey-churned earth, broken wire, and blackened stumps of trees reaching skyward like the hands of the drowned. The air was instantly alive with the whip-crack of bullets and the heavier, tearing sound of machine gun fire. The rhythm so fast it was almost a single, unbroken roar, and you felt the breath tear from your lungs as you dropped low, legs pumping through mud that clung like wet cement. The weight of the rifle across your chest, both anchor and lifeline, as the ground in front of you erupted in fountains of dirt and shrapnel. Tommy was ahead, a lean shadow in the fog and smoke, his head ducked, his gait uneven as though every step had to fight the ground itself, and you kept him in sight without knowing why. Perhaps because he was the one familiar shape in this chaos, the one who had spoken to you like you were more than just another shadow to be swallowed by the morning. Somewhere to your right, a man went down without a sound, his helmet rolling away to vanish in the mire, and you flinched, not at the sight, but at how quickly the space he had occupied was swallowed by the forward surge, as if the earth had decided it would not remember him. A shell burst to your left, the concussion slamming into you like a wall of water, and for a second there was no sound but a high, thin ringing in your ears. The world reduced to blurred motion and the smell of raw earth and hot metal, and when the sound came back it was in layers, shouting, gunfire, the heavy hump of mortar, or folding into the single fact that you were still moving forward. The German line emerged from the haze like something half-remembered from a fever dream. Dark shapes hunched behind their own wall of sandbags and timber, the flicker of muzzle flashes marking each position, and you felt the strange lurch of understanding that these men were not phantoms but flesh and bone. Their fear as real as yours, their orders given in a language you did not speak, but whose meaning was carved into the air with each burst of fire. Tommy dropped to one knee, firing from behind a ragged post that might once have been part of a fence, and you slid in beside him, fumbling the rifle to your shoulder, the recoil jarring through you as the first shot left the barrel, the sound swallowed instantly by the vast machinery of battle around you. There was no sense of time here. No minutes or hours, only the next movement, the next breath, the next space between the bursts of gunfire where you dared to lift your head, and when the order came, shouted, gestured, impossible to misinterpret, you were on your feet again, pushing through a gap in the wire that had been blasted open by some earlier bombardment, the ends of the rusted metal curling toward you like claws. A figure lunged from the smoke ahead, close enough that you saw the whites of his eyes before he dropped his weapon and raised his hands, his mouth forming words you could not hear, and for a moment the war shrank to the two of you, his breath quick in the chill air, yours ragged in your throat, until someone behind you shouted and the moment shattered into motion again. The German trench was nothing like your own, deeper, narrower, lined with neat timber that the shelling had only partly destroyed, and as you dropped into it the sudden enclosure felt like stepping underwater. The noise muffled, replaced by the close sounds of boots on wood and the rasp of men catching their breath in the shadows. Tommy was there again, mud to his knees, one sleeve torn, grinning in that way soldiers sometimes do when the thing they feared has happened and they have lived through it, at least for now, and he clapped your shoulder before turning to follow the others deeper along the trench, where the air was thicker and the light dimmer and the war felt somehow closer for being unseen. A prisoner was being led past, his hands bound with a strip of canvas, his gaze fixed on some point far beyond you, and you wondered if this was the same look your own eyes would wear if the positions were reversed, if all you could think about was the line of sky above you, and whether you would ever see it from your own ground again. Somewhere ahead a flare went up, its pale light filtering down into the trench like cold moonlight, and the men moved in its glow with the wary precision of those who knew that nothing was ever truly safe here, that each step forward was borrowed from a future that might not arrive, and as you followed them, you felt the strange pull of the place itself, as if the earth had decided to keep you, to fold you into its story whether you belonged to it or not. The night stretched on endlessly as you huddled in the narrow space between the wall and the iron stove, the low crackle of the fire the only warmth against the damp chill that had seeped into your bones, and outside the faint sound of boots on cobblestones came and went like passing ghosts, each time making your breath catch in your throat as you imagined uniformed figures sweeping in to tear open the door, yet each time the sound faded again into the muffled quiet of the sleeping town, and in those hours your mind began to wander, to drift between wakefulness and uneasy dreams. And in one of those dreams you were standing on a railway platform, the air thick with steam and coal dust, watching an endless procession of soldiers boarding a long line of dark green carriages, their faces pale in the morning light, their eyes fixed forward as if they were already somewhere far away. And then you were walking among them, unseen, feeling the vibration of the train through the soles of your boots, hearing the metallic groan of couplings as if the whole machine was straining to hold itself together. And when the whistle blew, it was so loud you woke with a start, the dream collapsing into the crackle of the stove and the dim room around you, and across from you, in the shadows, you could just make out the figure of the old man, sitting with his back to the wall, his head bowed as if he were asleep. But when he spoke, his voice was soft and steady, telling you that the road ahead was long and full of dangers, that there were people you must meet and things you must see if you were to understand the truth of the world you had fallen into. And as the fire burned lower and the room grew darker, you knew that whatever lay beyond that door, you would have to step into it soon, because in this place, in this time, to stand still was to be left behind by history itself. So you took a deep breath that seemed to carry both the lingering warmth of the room and the chill that seeped in from the street beyond the window, stepping forward with a cautious resolve because you knew the moment you crossed the threshold, you would be leaving behind not only the safety of four walls, but also the illusion that life could somehow remain untouched by the vast machine of war grinding away outside. The sound of boots on cobblestones reaching you before you even opened the door. Heavy synchronized steps belonging to soldiers you dared not meet the eyes of, and yet curiosity pulled at you. So when the door creaked open, you found yourself staring at a line of gray-coated figures moving with mechanical precision through the narrow street, their rifles held at the same angle, their breath clouding in the early morning air like smoke from a distant fire. And for a moment you felt as though you were not watching men at all, but a single living organism, something vast and impersonal that did not see you, did not care about you, and yet would crush you without hesitation if you stepped into its path, so you stayed on the doorstep, watching them pass, your fingers gripping the frame until the last helmet dipped out of view around the corner, and the silence that followed felt even heavier than the march itself, as if the air were waiting to see what you would do next, and you realized that the city around you was already awake in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary mornings, that behind shuttered windows and half-drawn curtains there were eyes watching, ears straining, hearts beating faster at the sound of every passing patrol, and you began to walk, slowly at first, your shoes making a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness, each step a small declaration that you intended to move, to find something, someone, perhaps even a reason for being here at all. The street was narrow, the buildings leaning in over you like a crowd of silent witnesses, and the air carried the scent of smoke from somewhere you could not see, a scent that mingled with the faint aroma of baking bread from a shop whose door was propped open despite the cold. And as you passed you caught sight of a woman behind the counter kneading dough with quick nervous motions, her eyes flicking toward the street every few seconds as if expecting someone or something to appear at any moment, and when she noticed you, she froze for a fraction of a heartbeat, then gave the smallest nod, a nod that seemed to contain both welcome and warning, and you returned it without breaking stride, because somehow you understood that in this place, every gesture was measured, every word weighed before it left the mouth, and you had none to spare just yet, not until you understood who was listening. You turned a corner and the world seemed to open slightly, the narrow alley giving way to a small square where a fountain stood dry and cracked in the center, its stone figures worn smooth by years of wind and rain, and here there were more people: an old man pushing a cart piled with firewood, a pair of children kicking a battered tin can back and forth, a woman with a basket of vegetables glancing up every few seconds, as if the sky itself might bring danger, and you moved among them with a kind of deliberate slowness, trying to appear as though you belonged here, as though you too had errands to run and a home to return to. But in truth, every face you saw, every whispered exchange you overheard felt like part of a puzzle, whose picture you could not yet see, and the urge to piece it together grew stronger with each passing moment, as though understanding it might be the only way to survive. Beyond the square you found another street, wider this time, and on its far side loomed a building with tall windows and a flag draped across its facade, the red and black stark against the pale morning light, and you knew without needing to be told that this was a place of authority, perhaps even fear, because the people walking past it did so with their eyes downcast, their bodies angled slightly away as though proximity alone might draw unwanted attention, and you felt the pull of both danger and necessity. The knowledge that answers might be found inside, matched only by the certainty that entering would change you in ways you could not yet imagine. So you lingered at the edge of the street, weighing the risk, until a sudden shout from somewhere behind made you turn heart-pounding to see a young man stumble as a soldier grabbed his arm, demanding papers in a voice that cut through the square like a blade. And though the exchange lasted only seconds, though the man was released with a shove and hurried away without looking back, the message was clear: you were in a place where identity was not assumed but constantly proven, and yours was something you did not yet possess. That realization pushed you onward, past the building with the flag, past the eyes that seemed to follow you from unseen corners, and into another warren of streets where the houses were smaller, the windows closer to the ground, and the air carried the scent of coal smoke and unwashed wool, and here the faces you saw were different, more worn, more guarded, the lines etched deep around the eyes and mouths, speaking of years lived under a weight you could only begin to guess at. And as you passed one doorway, a man leaned out just far enough to drop a bundle into the hands of a boy who ran off without a word, disappearing into the shadows at the end of the lane, and you could not tell if what you had just seen was innocent or forbidden, only that it was conducted with the speed and secrecy of something that mattered greatly. A dog barked somewhere ahead, sharp and sudden, and then again, closer, until you saw it, a thin, wiry creature standing in the middle of the street, its ears flat, eyes fixed on you as though it could sense the strangeness in your presence, and for a moment you simply stared at each other, two beings caught in a space neither entirely safe nor entirely hostile, until it turned and trotted off, disappearing between two buildings. and you found yourself following without really knowing why, your feet carrying you into a narrow passage that smelled faintly of damp earth and iron. The walls so close, your shoulders brushed them as you moved, and at the end of it you emerged into a courtyard, where laundry hung limp on lines strung between crumbling walls, and in the center stood a woman with a scarf tied tightly around her head, her hands plunged into a bucket of soapy water, and when she saw you she paused, her gaze sharp and assessing, before she spoke in a low voice that carried a hint of both question and command, words you could not understand, but whose meaning you felt in the weight of her eyes, and before you could respond she gestured for you to come closer, glancing over her shoulder as though the walls themselves might be listening. You stepped toward her, the damp air heavy with the scent of soap and coal, and in that moment you knew that whatever she was about to tell you, or ask of you, was going to draw you deeper into this world, deeper into the reality of a war that was no longer something you could observe from a distance, but something you would live inside, every breath shaped by it, every choice bound to it, because here there was no such thing as standing still. You felt the damp cobblestones beneath your boots slick with last night's rain as the pale light of morning broke timidly over the jagged rooftops of the occupied city, casting long shadows that trembled and shifted with the cold breeze, and you kept moving through narrow alleys, whose walls were so close they seemed to breathe with you, the smell of wet brick and faint smoke clinging to the air as if the city itself had been smoldering for weeks, and in truth it had, because somewhere beyond the reach of your sight fires still burned in the industrial quarter, where an Allied bombing run had struck only days ago, and the whispers of that destruction still carried in the voices of those who passed you, their eyes darting to your coat, to your face, to your boots, as if searching for a sign of who you truly were, and whether you belonged here in this place where suspicion had become as common as hunger, and you pulled the collar of your coat higher, trying to blend into the slow-moving tide of workers, heading toward the tramline, their footsteps muffled in the wet morning, while overhead the black wires crisscrossed like an immense web, and every now and then a German soldier in his grey-green uniform stood at a corner, rifle slung but eyes sharp, scanning the crowd as though each face was a puzzle to be solved, and you kept your gaze down, passing under the shadow of a half-collapsed archway, where the bricks still jutted at odd angles from the blast that had ripped it apart months ago, and beyond it the street opened onto a small market square where a few thin stalls were set up, their wares meager and guarded fiercely by tired women whose hands were red and raw from the cold, selling turnips, carrots, a few hard loaves of bread that looked more like bricks than food, and you felt the pinch of hunger in your stomach as you remembered that the last proper meal you'd eaten was before the city had changed hands, before the uniforms on the street had shifted from the warm brown of local police to the steel grey of the Wehrmacht, and you thought of how quickly normal life could evaporate, how a place you knew could become foreign in a matter of hours, how friends could vanish in the night, and how silence could be as loud as an explosion when it was the silence of streets emptied by fear, and you moved through the square toward the far side, where an old church loomed, its spire blackened from soot, its bells silent because the occupiers had stripped them for metal months ago, and you slipped through the side door into the dim, cool air of the nave, where candles flickered before a worn altar and the scent of wax mixed with the faint must of stone, and you saw only two people inside, an elderly man kneeling at the front, muttering prayers under his breath, and a woman in a heavy shawl who sat near the back, her eyes closed, as though in sleep, and you kept to the shadows, walking down a side aisle toward the vestry where you knew you might find what you were looking for, because whispers in the night had spoken of a man here, a priest, who was not just a priest but something more, a messenger, a smuggler of news and names, a thread in the invisible web of resistance that wound its way through the cracks of the occupied world. And when you reached the vestry door, it opened before you could knock, and a thin man with deep-set eyes looked out, his gaze flicking over your shoulder to the empty nave, before settling on your face, and he said nothing but stepped aside, allowing you to enter the small room lined with shelves of dusty books and faded vestments. Once the door closed, he spoke softly, asking how you had found him and whether you knew what danger you brought by standing here, and you told him in as few words as you could about the paper you carried, the names on it, the routes it described, the people who needed it, and his expression grew hard, not with doubt but with the weight of knowing exactly what such a thing could cost. And he took the paper from you, tucking it into the lining of his cassock without unfolding it. He told you to leave, not later but now, because the longer you stayed, the sharper the danger grew, and though you wanted to ask questions to understand where it would go or who would see it, you knew this was not the time for explanations. So you nodded and slipped back out into the market square where the day had grown brighter, though the clouds still hung low, and you joined the flow of people toward the tramline again, the iron rails gleaming wet in the light, as the distant hum of the approaching car grew louder, and you thought of the thin man in the vestry, and the way his eyes had looked past you as if already scanning the next danger that might walk through his door, and you realized that in this city survival was not about winning or losing, but about moving without stopping, without drawing too much notice, and about trusting that the pieces you set in motion might reach their destination, even if you never knew their fate. And so you stepped onto the tram, and when it arrived, its doors creaking, its interior smelling of damp wool and coal smoke, and you took a seat near the back where you could watch the street roll by. Through the street glass, and the city passed in a blur of shuttered shops, boarded windows, and the occasional sight of a soldier standing with his back to the wall, his rifle cradled casually, but his eyes following the tram as though each passenger was a question waiting to be answered. And the further you went, the more you noticed the outskirts changing the streets, widening the buildings, giving way to low warehouses and yards, filled with the skeletal remains of bombed-out vehicles, their twisted frames glistening from the rain, and the tram rattled on until it reached its last stop, where only a handful of passengers remained. And you stepped down onto a platform slick with puddles, the air colder here, and carrying a faint, metallic tang that made you think of the factories beyond the rise ahead. And you started walking toward them, knowing that somewhere among those smoke-belching stacks and guarded gates was the next link in the chain you had agreed to follow, though you still did not know where it would end. The air was damp with the heavy breath of the city, the kind that clung to your clothes and made the morning feel older than it was. And as you stepped out from the shadow of the ruined arcade, the street unfolded ahead of you like an open wound, cobblestones scarred with the tracks of vehicles that had passed in the night, and littered with splinters of glass that caught the first rays of sunlight in a way that made them look almost pretty, almost harmless, if you didn't know they had once been the windows of a bakery, a pharmacy, a tailor's shop, now gutted by shellfire. Somewhere up the road, a man in a flat cap pushed a cart piled with burlap sacks, his back bent, his pace steady, the wheels rattling against the uneven stones, and he didn't look up as you passed him, didn't acknowledge the way you shifted to the side to give him room, because everyone here had learned that eye contact could be a risk, not because they feared each other, but because each glance carried the possibility of recognition by the wrong person. Someone watching from a doorway or behind a lace curtain, someone who would remember your face and whisper it to the soldiers who walked these streets in polished boots. You found yourself tracing the sounds rather than the sights. The quick steps of a woman carrying a bundle of laundry under one arm, the slow creak of a shutter opening above you, the distant clanging of metal that could have been the rail yard or a workshop, salvaging what little steel was left. And it occurred to you that in this city even noise felt rationed, dulled out in small, careful portions, so as not to draw too much attention to any one place. It wasn't until you turned the corner by the tram stop, the one where a faded map of the city still clung to the wall despite the corners curling and the colors bleeding from rain, that you saw the notice board, a large wooden frame nailed to the brick, layered with announcements, ration schedules, and orders printed in 2 languages, one familiar and one heavy with foreign consonants. And pinned at the very top was a fresh poster with block letters in red warning against harboring enemies of the state and promising swift justice to any who disobeyed. You were still reading the smaller print beneath, the kind that most people pretended not to see, when you heard the crunch of boots approaching from behind, the deliberate synchronized rhythm of men walking in formation, and without thinking you stepped aside, toward the wall, your eyes fixed on a crack in the pavement as the soldiers passed. 4 of them, rifles slung across their shoulders, faces unreadable under their caps, each glance sweeping over the street like a cold tide before they vanished around the bend. When you finally looked up again, the man at the cart was gone, the tram stop empty, and for a moment it was as if the street itself had exhaled, the pressure lifting just enough for you to move again, to keep walking toward the market square where, you had been told, there was a woman who sold bread early if you knew how to ask, but only if she trusted you, only if you didn't bring trouble to her door. As you crossed the square, you noticed how the statues in the center, once proud stone figures of statesmen and poets, now bore the crude marks of chisels where names and inscriptions had been removed. The smooth spaces left behind like blank gravestones, and it struck you how even memory was being rationed here. History itself reshaped to fit the needs of those who held power. You stepped into the shade of an awning where the bread stall should have been, the air rich with the scent of yeast and smoke, and there she was. A thin woman with sleeves rolled up past her elbows, hair pulled tight under a scarf, her hands moving quickly as she wrapped a loaf in brown paper and slid it across the counter to a man who left without a word. And when her eyes met yours, there was no smile, no greeting, just the slightest pause before she nodded a signal so small you might have missed it, if you hadn't been looking for it, and then she asked, in a voice that carried nothing but quiet business, for you or for someone else. The dawn was thin and pale as it crept over the city, filtering through the smoke-hazed sky with a light that seemed too fragile for a world at war. And as you stepped out from the shadowed alley into the wider street, the cobblestones cold underfoot and the air sharp with the smell of coal fires and distant cordite, you realized that the day ahead would not wait for hesitation. For the rumble of trucks somewhere beyond the next block was growing louder, their heavy tires slapping the road like the footsteps of an approaching storm. And with each throb of the engine you felt your pulse matching its rhythm, urging you to move quickly before those unseen soldiers rounded the corner. You kept to the edge of the building's passing doorways, where curtains twitched and figures pulled back into the safety of their homes, each face etched with the quiet fear of people who had learned that survival often meant invisibility, and your mind traced the map of the city you had only begun to know, trying to piece together a route that would take you farther from danger and closer to the whispered destination that the old bookseller had mentioned. The place where others, like you, displaced, hunted, uncertain, had found some measure of safety beneath the war's endless noise. Somewhere ahead, beyond the rows of brick and stone, you could hear the faint sound of a radio playing a tune so soft it seemed almost impossible against the harshness of the world outside. A melody that spoke of another time, one where laughter wasn't muffled and the future wasn't rationed. And that thread of music pulled you forward like a lifeline, your footsteps light but your senses sharp, every movement calculated in case a soldier's eyes caught the flicker of your shadow or the scrape of your boot on the ground. The street bent left into a narrower lane where laundry lines sagged between windows like tired flags, the white and grey sheets swaying in the faint breeze, and you passed beneath them with your head down, the scent of soap briefly masking the smell of burning from somewhere far off. But as you stepped into the open again, you saw the trucks, no three of them, rolling slowly down the far end of the lane, their grey paint dulled by dust and their canvas covers hiding whatever cargo they carried, though you caught sight of the glint of rifles slung over the shoulders of the men riding in the back, their faces turned outward like wolves scanning the dark. You slipped between two buildings into a cramped passage no wider than your shoulders, the walls damp and rough, your hand brushing over the cold brick as you moved through the gloom until the space widened again into a small courtyard, the kind that might have once held the chatter of children playing, but now held only silence and the scattered remains of a life interrupted. An overturned chair, a shattered teacup, a bicycle with its tires rotted and chain rusted solid, and you paused there, breath slow, listening for the sound of pursuit, but hearing only the faint creak of a shutter swaying on its hinges. In that stillness, you remembered the bookseller's final words before you left his shop, the way his voice had dropped to a whisper as he spoke of the cellar under the baker's shop, 2 streets over, a place hidden behind flour sacks where a trapdoor led to tunnels older than the city itself, and how he had said that if you reached it before nightfall, you might find more than bread. You might find a chance to survive the days to come, a chance to understand why you had been drawn into this time and place at all. So you moved on, slipping from one shadow to the next, the distant trucks fading into the hum of the city, your eyes searching for the faint curl of baking smoke that would guide you toward the promise of the cellar. Your steps careful but steady, because in this world there was no safety in standing still. Only the hope that moving forward might lead you somewhere the war could not reach at least for a little while. The air inside the cramped rail carriage was thick with the mingled smells of coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint metallic temps of fear. The wooden benches creaking under the shifting weight of soldiers who tried not to meet each other's eyes too directly, as though acknowledging the shared dread would make it more real. And as you sat wedged between a young infantryman with a scuffed rifle balanced awkwardly between his knees and an older man with the weathered face of someone who had already seen one war and lived to regret it, you could feel the rhythm of the train under you like a slow mechanical heartbeat, carrying all of you deeper into uncertainty. Every lurch forward a reminder that no one aboard had chosen this path willingly, yet here you were, each of you a small piece in a vast machine. You could neither see nor stop, and when you glanced out the window past your own faint reflection, the landscape blurred into a patchwork of winter fields and skeletal trees. Each village you passed looking quieter, emptier, as though the very air had been drained of laughter and color. The young soldier beside you tried to speak once, his voice catching before the words could form, and instead he offered you a half-smile that carried more apology than friendliness, while the older man just watched the horizon with eyes narrowed against memories, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle in a way that suggested habit more than readiness. And when the train finally screeched into a station, it was NT, the orderly scene you might have imagined, but a chaos of shouted orders, boots clattering against the platform, and the heavy thump of crates being thrown from one set of hands to another. The cold wind rushing in as the doors banged open, making you pull your coat tighter, while the acrid scent of smoke from somewhere far off reached your nose and made you think of burning cities you had never seen. Stepping down onto the platform, you felt the crunch of grit under your boots, the boards slick with frost, and you followed the slow current of men funneling toward a waiting line of trucks painted in dull camouflage that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Each one already half filled with soldiers staring blankly ahead as though trying to picture where they would be in an hour's time. And as you climbed aboard your assigned truck, the metal floor biting cold through the soles of your boots, the tailgate clanged shut behind you with a finality that made your chest tighten, the engine growling to life before lurching forward down a road, flanked by bare hedgerows and the occasional abandoned farmhouse with its shutters hanging loose like broken teeth. The road wound on and the hours slipped by without a word spoken, the silence broken only by the grind of gears and the occasional cough from someone hidden under a scarf, until the truck finally slowed, bounced over a shallow ditch, and rolled into what looked like the remnants of an old farmyard now converted into a makeshift military post, the barn walls reinforced with sandbags and the smell of wet hay mixing uneasily with the sharp chemical scent of fuel, and you were herded off the truck into the biting wind, where a sergeant with a voice like gravel began barking instructions so quickly you barely caught your own name, directing you toward a long low hut where the dim glow of a lantern illuminated a row of narrow bunks, and the steam of men's breath hung in the air like mist. That night, lying on a thin mattress with your coat still on and your pack as a pillow, you listened to the murmurs of those around you, fragments of conversation about home, about letters that might never arrive, about rumors of where you'd be sent next. And the more you tried to piece together what your own future might look like, the more you realized how impossible it was to see beyond the next morning. And when you finally drifted into a restless half-sleep, it was to the distant rumble of artillery somewhere over the horizon, a sound you knew you would have to grow used to if you meant to survive here at all. When the morning came, it wasn't the bugle that woke you, but the sharp crack of boots on frozen ground outside the hut, followed by the sergeant's bark ordering everyone up. And as you stumbled into the pale light, you saw a convoy forming, trucks and jeeps idling while men loaded crates and fuel cans, the breath of engines and men alike billowing into the frigid air, and without ceremony you found yourself handed a rifle, the wood worn smooth by many hands before yours, its cold weight settling against your shoulder as naturally as if it had always been there. And before you had time to ask where you were going, You were already climbing back into a truck, the whole column rumbling out through a gap in the hedgerows and onto the open road that stretched toward a sky heavy with low clouds, the smell of snow lingering just out of reach. The day passed in a blur of movement, the countryside giving way to patches of forest where the trees stood silent and watchful, their trunks painted in streaks of frost, and each time the convoy stopped, you would see soldiers jump down to check maps, their voices hushed as though even in daylight they feared being overheard, and when the sun finally began to set behind the bare branches, it seemed to take with it not just the light but any illusion that this journey was leading somewhere safe, because as darkness closed in, you began to notice the faint orange glow of fires far off to the east, and here, beneath the steady rumble of engines, the low dull thump of explosions carried on the wind. By the time the trucks halted for the night, you had lost all sense of direction, the stars hidden by cloud and the air smelling faintly of smoke. And when you were ordered to disembark, you found yourself standing in the middle of what had once been a village square, the outlines of buildings looming in the shadows, their windows empty and black, the snow crunching under your boots as you followed the others toward a building that still had part of its roof, the dim light inside casting long shaky shadows against the walls. And it was there, as you lowered yourself onto the cold floor and tried to ignore the distant echo of gunfire. But you understood this war would not wait for you to be ready, it would come whether you had the strength for it or not. The cold seeped into your bones as you lay on the hard floor of the ruined farmhouse, the faint flicker of a lantern casting shadows that danced across the cracked plaster walls. And somewhere outside, the distant thunder of artillery rolled like a storm gathering its strength, a reminder that the night was never truly silent in this war-torn land. And as you pulled your coat tighter around your shoulders, you found yourself listening not just to the sounds but to the spaces between them, the creak of wood settling, the soft murmur of voices speaking in low tones, the occasional scrape of a boot on gravelland. In those moments you realized that survival here was a matter of patience, of waiting for the war to pass you by just long enough to catch your breath before it came crashing back. Morning arrived, not with the soft promise of dawn but with the cold glare of overcast skies, the sun hidden behind a blanket of steel-gray clouds that seemed to press down on the world. And as you stood outside with the others, the crunch of snow beneath your boots mingling with the sharp, bitter wind that bit at your exposed skin, you watched the officers moving through the group, their faces set and unreadable, passing out orders that would shape the hours to come. Though what those orders meant in the grand scheme remained a mystery even to those who gave them. You were assigned to a squad of men whose faces told stories you had not yet learned to read, the young, wide-eyed recruits whose hands trembled as they checked their rifles, the hardened veterans with eyes like flint who moved with a quiet confidence born from too many battles survived, and the ones who had lost too much and found nothing left to hope for. Their expressions carved in stone, and their voices little more than gruff whispers, and as you fell in with them, you felt the weight of belonging and alienation twisting inside you, a knot of uncertainty that tightened with every passing moment. The squad moved out into the grey morning, the landscape around you a desolate sprawl of frozen fields and shattered trees, the remnants of homes reduced to rubble and ash, and each step felt like walking through the ghosts of a life that had once been children playing. Markets bustling, lovers whispering promises beneath the stars, but now replaced by the dull roar of distant guns and the sharp crack of sniper fire that could come without warning, stealing lives and dreams alike. And you learned quickly that the silence between shots was the most dangerous sound of all, because it meant the enemy was waiting, watching, calculating. Your squad reached the edge of a small wood, the bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. And there, beneath the twisted limbs and tangled undergrowth, you caught sight of a trench system carved into the earth. Mud-caked and frost-lined, the remnants of hastily erected defenses that had once offered some measure of protection, but now looked as fragile as glass. And as the men began to prepare for what was to come, checking weapons, sharing whispered plans, and stealing brief moments of camaraderie in the face of the unknown, you felt a cold determination settle over you. A quiet resolve that this time, you would not be the one left behind. The hours passed in a blur of preparation and waiting, the sky growing heavier with clouds that threatened snow. And when the order finally came to advance, It was with the grim understanding that nothing would be the same after this day that the line between survival and sacrifice was thinner than the blade of a knife, and that history would remember only the moments when the living moved forward into the storm, leaving the dead to echo in the silence behind. The morning was swallowed in a dense, oppressive fog that curled like restless spirits through the shattered streets, muffling sound until the world felt distant and muted, the heavy gray drape blurring the broken outlines of buildings like a watercolor left out in rain. And as you stepped forward through the wet rubble and slush, the cold seeped slowly into your bones, an insistent ache that reminded you this place was not just foreign but unforgiving, a world held together by fear and the fragile hope that the next breath would come easier than the last. The soldiers around you moved with careful precision, their faces set in grim lines beneath helmets, scratched and dented from countless scrapes with death, and the air was thick with the scent of earth, turned up by shell blasts mingled with the acrid stench of burnt rubber and gasoline, each inhalation a reminder that this war was not a distant story but a living, breathing beast that fed on blood and smoke alike. Your squad had been ordered to secure the eastern edge of the village, a patchwork of collapsed homes and twisted metal fencing where the enemy might be waiting behind every shattered window or crouching among the debris. And as you advanced, the soundscape was a mixture of crunching glass, the distant rat-a-tat of machine gun fire, and the occasional barked command, clipped and urgent, slicing through the cold air like a knife. You moved with a rhythm born from necessity. Step, scan, step, duck, breathe. Each motion rehearsed over countless drills, yet now soaked in the raw immediacy of life or death, your heart thrumming beneath your ribs in time with the distant booms that shook the ground and sent small clouds of dust into the freezing air. Time became slippery here, each moment stretched by anticipation and fear until minutes felt like hours, and the light shifted subtly. The sun obscured behind the thick, gray canopy above, casting the world in a monochrome palette that swallowed color and hope alike, the only brightness coming from the pale faces of the men you fought alongside, eyes darting nervously, lips pressed thin, fingers tightening on rifle stocks, and in that shared silence, you felt the weight of countless stories layered like sediment beneath the mud and concrete, stories of lives interrupted and futures stolen, whispered in the shudder of a breath or the shiver running through a soldier's frame as a shell exploded too close or a bullet tore through the cold air. As you edged closer to a half-collapsed farmhouse that seemed to lean precariously over the street like a tired sentinel, you heard the faintest sound, a cough muffled and ragged, followed by a whispered plea for help, and pushing through the rubble-strewn doorway you found a young woman crouched against a crumbling wall, her clothes, torn face smudged with soot and tears, eyes wide and fearful, but alive. And in that instant, the war took on a human shape that words could never capture, a fragile pulse of hope in a place where hope was a rare and precious thing. And as you reached out to help her, your hands trembling with cold and uncertainty, she whispered a name you recognized, one that tethered her to the world you once knew, and suddenly the distant noise of gunfire and artillery, WAR2, just backgrounded, was the soundtrack to a story you were no longer merely witnessing but a part of. You carried her carefully back to the relative shelter of the trench lines, your breath pluming in the freezing air, each step heavy with the knowledge that every moment brought new dangers. And as the squad gathered around to tend to her wounds with rough hands and rougher cloth, you caught the flicker of exhaustion in their eyes, the quiet understanding that this war was as much about endurance as it was about fighting. And in the dim glow of a shared cigarette passed from one pair of fingers to another, stories spilled out of lost brothers, of letters never sent, of quiet acts of kindness amid the chaos, and, though the words were often soft and tentative, you realized that in this darkness, connection was a lifeline as vital as ammunition. The day stretched on, and orders came down to push forward, to reclaim the street beyond the ruined bakery, where the enemy had set up a machine gun nest that had pinned your unit for hours. And as you prepared for the assault, the tension coiled tight in your stomach, a storm of adrenaline and dread. And when the signal was given, a sharp whistle cutting through the winter air, you charged, running low and fast, boots pounding against cracked pavement, breath ragged, the sharp report of rifles and the thudding echo of mortar exploding around you. Every second was a blur of motion and noise, fear and determination. And as the enemy fire slowed and then ceased, the street fell silent save for the ragged breathing of those who survived, and you stood there, heart hammering, the snow beginning to fall softly like a benediction on the broken world around you. Night came with bitter cold and little rest. The men huddled in their trenches, wrapped in threadbare blankets or simply pressing backs to the earth, sharing what warmth they could. And as you stared up at a sky smudged with clouds that hid even the faintest star, you thought of the countless souls lost in battles like this one, the faces of friends and strangers alike fading into the mist of memory, and the strange paradox of war that, in moments of great destruction, there could also be a fragile, flickering flame of humanity, burning quietly in the hearts of those who refused to give up, who found meaning in survival, and in the hope that one day, this nightmare would end, and the world might find its way back to peace. It was still raining when you emerged from the narrow alleyway that twisted like a ribbon between the rows of darkened buildings, the kind of rain that seemed to soak not just your clothes, but the very air you breathed, leaving each step accompanied by the soft squelch of damp leather against wet cobblestone, and for a moment you wondered whether the city itself was trying to wash away the layers of grime, fear and whispered secrets that clung to it as stubbornly as soot on brick. But the flicker of a dim street lamp ahead broke that thought, its light pooling in a small golden circle like a fragile promise in a world that had forgotten the meaning of promises. And you adjusted your coat, pulling it tighter around your shoulders as you kept moving forward, because standing still in weather like this, in times like these, was an invitation for trouble to find you. Somewhere to your left, beyond the shuttered windows and rain-streaked facades, the muffled thump of boots against wooden floors hinted at the restless presence of soldiers. And though you couldn't see them, you could picture their silhouettes moving inside shadows cast by single bare bulbs, rifles propped against walls, the smell of damp wool and tobacco curling in the air, and it made you instinctively lower your head as you passed, as if the weight of the sky itself was urging you to become smaller, less noticeable, a mere ripple in the endless stream of wartime movement. When you reached the edge of the square, you paused, your eyes scanning the open space ahead, where the rain had turned the cobblestones into a shifting mosaic of reflections, each puddle holding its own distorted version of the world aspire. Here, a shadowed doorway. There a flicker of movement that might have been nothing but your imagination, and you felt the pull of that place. The way the square seemed both deserted and watched, empty yet full of invisible eyes. And you knew crossing it would mean exposing yourself entirely. But there was no other way forward if you wanted to reach the safe house before curfew locked the city down. You stepped into the square, each stride deliberate, each breath measured, and as you reached the center you caught sight of the statue that stood there, its bronze surface streaked with rain, a relic from another era when the man it depicted had been a hero of a different war. A war whose lessons had apparently been forgotten, and you thought about how strange it was that monuments endured while the living vanished, replaced by new names, new uniforms, new battles that felt both inevitable and absurd. And for a heartbeat the whole scene, the rain, the statue, the dim lights, the oppressive air felt like a dream you might wake from if only you could remember how. But the sound that cut through the rain was no dream, it was the slow crunch of boots behind you, a rhythm too deliberate to be coincidence, and though you didn't turn your head, your senses sharpened every detail around you, becoming painfully clear. The faint smell of gasoline from a nearby truck, the metallic temps of rain against stone, the way your heartbeat seemed to sync with the footsteps closing in, and you told yourself not to run. Not yet, because running would make you prey. And prey didn't survive long in this kind of city. You reached the far side of the square and slipped into another street, narrower this time, lined with buildings whose shutters had been nailed shut so long ago that ivy had begun to creep across them like green veins. And you ducked beneath the overhang of a bakery whose sign still swayed in the wind, though no bread had been baked there in years. And for a moment you pressed yourself into the shadows, letting the footsteps pass, letting whoever had been behind you move ahead until they were swallowed by the darkness at the far end of the street. Only then did you resume walking your destination, now close enough that you could feel the tension in your shoulders begin to shift. replaced by a different kind of alertness, the kind that came when you knew you were about to enter a place where whispers carried more weight than orders, where the right word could save you and the wrong one could see you vanish before dawn. And as you approached the unmarked door at the end of the lane, you gave 3 soft knocks, a pause, then to more, the pattern etched into your memory like a lifeline. The door creaked open just enough for a single eye to peer out. A voice murmured a question you recognized but didn't fully understand, and you replied with the answer you'd been taught. The one that made no sense except to those who needed it to, and the door opened wider, pulling you into the dim interior where the scent of damp wood mingled with the faint sweetness of tea, and you stepped inside, feeling the weight of the city's wet air slip from your shoulders, even as you knew it still clung to your coat, still lingered in your hair, still marked you as someone moving through a world where every moment could turn from safety to danger in a breath. And in that breath, the story deepened. The street beyond the shattered wall stretched ahead like the mouth of some sleeping giant, wide and dark and littered with the bones of what had once been a place of ordinary life. The cobblestones beneath your boots, cold and uneven beneath the drifting powder of snow that had fallen unnoticed through the night, carrying with it that strange muffled quiet which in a time of war felt more menacing than any sudden shout, because it meant no movement, no sound, no sign of human presence beyond your own cautious steps. Yet every shadow seemed to breathe and twitch as though it might suddenly shape itself into the figure of a soldier or the lean silhouette of someone waiting in ambush, and so you kept your head low and your eyes scanning your breath, clouding in front of you in short bursts that dissolved into the pale air. It was still early, the light not yet strong enough to reach into the narrow gaps between buildings, and as you moved deeper into the street, the air seemed to thicken with the smell of damp soot and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust or blood, a scent you had grown accustomed to without ever being able to ignore. The sort of smell that clung to ruined cities long after the shells had stopped falling, a lingering reminder of how much had been torn apart in so little time, and you could almost feel the memory of the chaos that had once thundered through here, still echoing against the walls, a ghost of sound pressed into the bricks themselves. Somewhere in the distance, carried faintly over the rooftops, came the hollow, rhythmic thud of artillery, not close enough to shake the ground beneath you, but close enough to make you pause for a moment, your heart instinctively tightening in your chest as though to brace against an impact that would never come. The sound so regular it might have been the heartbeat of some vast machine whose purpose was only to keep the war alive. And with each pulse of distant thunder, you felt the air between the buildings grow more brittle, as though the city itself knew the battle was crawling closer again, inch by inch, day by day. Turning a corner, you found yourself facing a small square, or what had once been one, though now its center was a crater half filled with rainwater and charred wood, and here too there was silence, the sort that felt like a test, as though the city were waiting to see if you would make the first sound, break the stillness, announce yourself, and you resisted the urge, stepping lightly around the edge of the square, your eyes tracing the shattered windows above, searching for the faintest ripple of movement behind them, though all you saw was the dull glint of light on glass and the weary droop of curtains that had not been drawn in weeks, maybe months. It was only when you reached the far side of the square that you saw the figure, tall, thin, wrapped in a coat that hung from his shoulders like it belonged to another man entirely, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a cap. And though his eyes flicked up to meet yours for the briefest instant, there was no recognition there, only the sharp, quick calculation of someone deciding whether you were a threat, and then he turned away, his hands buried deep in his pockets, walking on as though you had never crossed paths, his footsteps absorbed by the hush of the snow. Still, you could not shake the sense that your presence here, in this hour, had been noted, perhaps even marked somewhere unseen. And as you continued on, weaving through the streets toward the outskirts of the district, you began to feel again that same invisible thread tugging at you from somewhere, ahead, pulling you toward a destination you could not yet name, but which you felt certain was waiting for you with a patience that was almost unnatural, as if it had been waiting for far longer than you had even been alive. You passed by a row of shop fronts, their signs hanging crooked, letters faded or missing entirely, and in the pale smear of light above one doorway you noticed a strange mark, hastily painted in something dark and dry, the shape neither wholly a symbol nor a word, more like the memory of one, and though you could not place its meaning, it lodged itself in your mind immediately, as if somewhere deep inside you already knew its significance and simply could not draw it into focus. And for reasons you couldn't explain, you quickened your pace, as though whatever had left that mark might still be near. The streets began to slope downward, leading toward what looked like an industrial quarter, the tall skeletons of cranes and the rusted curve of rails emerging through the mist ahead. And as you drew closer, you could hear the slow creak of metal shifting in the cold wind, the groan of abandoned machinery that might never run again. And yet you felt certain that something here, something hidden among the shadows of the warehouses, was still alive, still moving, still watching. The morning broke with a sky of brittle grey, the kind that seemed to weigh heavily upon the rooftops and the cobbled streets below. And as you stepped out from the narrow doorway of the bakery where you had taken shelter for the night, the faint warmth of a single crust tucked inside your coat pocket, the chill air curled its way down the back of your neck and reminded you of just how thin the line was between survival and ruin in a city now shaped entirely by the rhythm of war. Because here every day was a careful balance between avoiding the attention of those in power and making yourself useful enough that you would not be cast aside or suspected of being one of the countless shadowy figures that the occupying soldiers feared might be watching them in return. Your footsteps echoed faintly as you moved along the edge of the street, keeping to the shadows of shop fronts with their windows boarded up or cracked from blasts that had come weeks ago, though still the smell of flour and yeast clung faintly in the air from the bakery behind you, a strange reminder that even in the midst of all this, life attempted in small, stubborn ways to imitate the patterns it had known before. And you thought about how strange it was that the sound of a rolling cart or the creak of a bicycle chain could exist in the same world as the bark of shouted orders and the thump of boots on pavement. A thin trail of smoke rose from somewhere ahead, curling lazily against the low sky, and though your first instinct was to turn away, smoke in these days was as likely to mean trouble as warmth. You felt the tug of curiosity, the pull that said knowing was always better than guessing, so you adjusted your pace and let your path bend toward it each step, drawing you deeper into a side of the city you had yet to walk since arriving here by pure accident of fate weeks ago. As you neared the corner where the smoke came from, you caught sight of a small group of people gathered around what looked like the remains of a bombed-out tram station, their faces thin and eyes darting constantly toward the main road as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. And when you stepped closer, one of them, a man with a heavy wool coat patched at the elbows and a scarf wrapped so high it nearly covered his mouth, looked directly at you in a way that was neither invitation nor warning, but something in between, the kind of glance that weighed and measured whether you might be worth the risk of speaking to at all. You realized quickly that the smoke was coming from a makeshift fire built inside the rusted frame of an old metal drum, its flames licking at scraps of wood and paper, and around it the people were passing small tins and enamel mugs, taking turns warming their hands before returning to their spots along the wall. And though the smell of the fire carried the sour tank of burned paint and oil, it was heat, and heat was something you had learned not to take for granted. The man in the patched coat finally stepped toward you, his voice low but steady as he asked where you had come from. And though you gave the answer you had used so many times now that it felt like a second skin in a nearby street, a need for food, a willingness to work, you could tell he did not believe you entirely. Yet for reasons you could not quite name, he gestured toward the fire and said you could stay for a while. So you stepped forward and let the warmth seep into your chilled fingers. From the corner of your eye you noticed a young woman sitting apart from the rest, her gaze fixed on something in her lap, and when you shifted to see what it was, you realized she was holding a crumpled photograph, its corners worn soft, and though the image was smudged and faded, you could make out the outlines of a man in uniform, his face smiling in a way that no one here seemed capable of anymore, and you wondered if he was still alive somewhere, or if this photograph was now all that remained of him. The man in the patched coat began speaking quietly to you about a plan, not in the reckless, whispered way of dreamers who imagined quick victories, but with the slow, careful cadence of someone who had been thinking about it for a long time. There was a convoy scheduled to pass through the southern checkpoint in 2 days, heavily guarded but carrying supplies meant for the garrison. And if a certain crate could be removed from that shipment before it reached the soldiers' hands, it could change things for a great many people in this district. Though the risk of being caught was high enough that most had refused outright when asked, you found yourself listening not just because of the danger, but because there was something in the way he spoke, a steady certainty, as though he had already mapped every alley and shadow you would need to pass through. That made you believe it might actually be possible, and when he asked if you knew your way well enough around the southern streets, you realized with a start that you did. For the meandering paths you had taken these past weeks had drawn the shape of the city in your mind without you even noticing. Before you could answer, the sound of distant engines broke through the soft crackle of the fire, and instantly the small group scattered from the open street, pressing themselves into doorways and behind collapsed walls, and you followed suit, the instinct to hide now second nature, your heart pounding as the low rumble grew louder until at last a truck rolled into view, its canvas-covered back swaying with the movement of whatever cargo it carried. The driver's eyes scanning the road ahead with attention you could feel even from your hiding place. When the truck was gone and the quiet returned, the man in the patched coat looked at you again, this time with something sharper in his gaze, and he said simply, "If you want to help, meet me here tomorrow at first light," before turning and walking away into the maze of alleys, leaving you with the lingering smell of the fire and the sudden awareness that you had just stepped, whether willingly or not, to a current that might carry you far deeper into the war than you had ever planned to go. The darkness of the countryside stretched before you like a great unbroken sea, the faint silver of moonlight barely managing to sketch the outlines of hedgerows and distant farmhouses, against a sky that was heavy with the smell of coming rain. And as the truck you rode in bounced over rutted tracks, you found yourself wondering how many of these fields and narrow roads had already felt the thunder of marching boots or the crushing weight of armored vehicles, because every rise and every dip in the landscape seemed to whisper of movements and decisions that were already shaping the fate of nations. And you could not escape the sensation that you were being carried deeper into the hidden machinery of the war, that vast and grinding process in which people like you were swept up like leaves in a storm. The driver, a man with the thick wrists and steady eyes of someone who had once known peacetime but no longer expected to see it again, kept his gaze fixed on the wavering path of light thrown by the truck's hooded headlamps, and beside you in the back 2 soldiers hunched beneath their coats, rifles resting between their knees, speaking only in short bursts of quiet German that you could not fully follow, but which carried the rhythm of tired men sharing observations more than strategy, and every so often one of them would glance at you, not with suspicion exactly, but with the faint, detached curiosity of a man wondering how someone had found themselves so far from where they belonged. The hours slid past in the uneven tempo of the truck's engine, until the black shape of a barn appeared ahead. Its great doors opened just enough to allow the vehicle inside, and when you stepped down you were met by the sharp smell of hay mingled with the faint metallic taints of oil and machinery, because within the dim interior several other trucks were parked and a pair of mechanics were bent over the engine of one, their hands moving with the speed of men who had learned that repairs in war were measured not in days or hours, but in whether something could be done before the next order came to move. It was here that you were guided toward a small wooden door in the barn's far wall, a door that opened into a surprisingly well-lit space where a man in a long coat and a tilted officer's cap sat behind a desk scattered with maps, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied you, then softening in a way that suggested recognition not of your face but of the type of person he thought you might be, someone who could be useful, someone whose presence here might be explained by necessity rather than accident. And, after a long silence, he gestured for you to sit, the leather chair creaking beneath you as he began to speak in German so clear and deliberate that even you could follow much of it, outlining the need for a courier, for a pair of eyes that might move unseen along certain roads now made dangerous by recent activity. You did not answer right away, partly because you were unsure how to, but also because you sensed that hesitation was expected here, that quick agreement would be read as something other than bravery. And as the officer poured 2 glasses from a squat bottle on the desk and slid one toward you, the liquid's amber surface catching the light, you thought about the strange position you were in. A traveler in someone else's war who could neither truly refuse nor fully accept without stepping further into its labyrinth. And outside the rain began to fall, each drop tapping against the barn roof with the faintest metallic ring, a sound that seemed to mark time in a way no clock could. When you finally spoke, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who knew that the choice had already been made somewhere in the back corridors of their own mind. And as the officer nodded and began to explain the route you would take at first light, you allowed yourself a moment to look around the room, at the maps pinned to the walls with lines drawn in red pencil, at the small stove in the corner giving off a soft heat, at the worn boots lined neatly by the door, as if even in war there was a place for order. And you realized that you were now part of this place, this moment, this fragment of history that would never be told in the grand books, but would live in the quiet spaces between them, where the true weight of events was often felt. The streets were now a strange mixture of exhaustion and resilience as you stepped through the soft mist that hung in the air like a curtain between you and whatever waited beyond, each step carrying the echo of your boots against stone that seemed to whisper stories of centuries past, even as the present roared in the distance with the rumble of truck engines and the dull thud of artillery fire somewhere far away. And you found yourself watching the way the townspeople moved, cautious yet determined, eyes darting toward every unfamiliar sound, yet hands still working, still carrying baskets of bread, still sweeping doorsteps as if clinging to fragments of normal life could keep the world from fully collapsing. And you thought that perhaps this was what survival truly looked like. Not the heroic charges you had imagined, but this quiet defiance in the face of constant threat. You turned a corner into a narrower street where the walls leaned in slightly, the plaster peeling away to reveal the bones of the buildings beneath, and here the air smelled faintly of damp and smoke, the sort of scent that seemed to have seeped into the very stones from years of conflict. And an old man was seated on a stool just outside his doorway, a cigarette dangling from his fingers and his gaze fixed on the cobblestones as though they might offer him some answer he had been waiting for since the first bombs fell. And when he looked up at you, his eyes were sharp, measuring, not hostile exactly, but searching for something, and you nodded to him in greeting, receiving only a slight tilt of his head in response, as if that was all the acknowledgement that times allowed. As you walked on, the sound of voices rose ahead, not panicked, but urgent, the sort of tones used when decisions needed to be made quickly, and you followed them to a small square where a group of locals stood around a makeshift table, maps spread out and marked with pins and bits of string. And at first you thought it might be some kind of official gathering, but then you saw the lack of uniforms, the mixture of clothing patched and worn, and realized this was no military unit but civilians organizing themselves, perhaps for resistance, perhaps for survival. And when one of them, a woman with her hair tied back and sleeves rolled to the elbow, caught sight of you, she hesitated for a moment before beckoning you closer with a look that suggested you were either about to be trusted with something important or tested in some way you couldn't yet see. You stepped into the circle, feeling the heat of their focus on you, and she pointed to the map, tracing a line with her finger that wound through back alleys and narrow paths, explaining in a low voice that there were movements tonight. Supply movements, guarded but vulnerable in the right circumstances. And though you had no training in sabotage or resistance warfare, you understood from her tone and the hard set of her jaw that this was not a discussion about if they would act, but about how and when. And in that moment you felt the strange weight of history pressing in, not as an abstract concept in a book, but as something living, breathing, depending on choices made here, now, by people who might never have considered themselves soldiers until they had no choice. She handed you a folded piece of paper, no bigger than your palm, and told you not to open it until you reached the corner by the church. And there was no time to ask questions before she turned back to the others, their murmured planning resuming as if you had simply been slotted into some pre-existing role. And so you stepped away from the square, tucking the paper into your coat, your mind buzzing with the unreality of it all. yet also with a growing understanding that you were no longer just an observer. Here you were becoming part of the mechanism that kept this fragile world moving forward against the grinding gears of the war. The church came into view sooner than you expected, its steeple dark against the overcast sky, and when you reached the corner you unfolded the paper, finding a small but precise sketch of a street you hadn't yet walked, a narrow lane with 3 doorways marked in red ink and a single word beneath, watch, and though it was hardly a clear instruction, you felt the weight of its simplicity. It meant vigilance, it meant presence, it meant being the eyes for someone else's action. And so you set off toward the lane, each step bringing you deeper into a web you could not yet see the edges of, each sound behind you making you glance over your shoulder, half expecting the world to tilt into chaos at any moment. The city was quieter now, not because the war had receded, but because night had drawn its curtain across the sky, swallowing up the faint light of the last fires, and leaving only the scattered embers of smoldering ruins to glow like dying stars in the streets. And I walked carefully through the rubble-strewn alleyways with my coat pulled tightly around me, the sharp winter wind biting at my ears and nose, while the sound of distant artillery thudded through the air like a slow and heavy heartbeat, each explosion sending a faint vibration through the soles of my boots, as if reminding me that the war never truly slept, and that even here in the shadowed outskirts of the city, there was no place untouched by its long and merciless reach. The narrow street opened into a small square that must have once been a place of gathering, a market perhaps, or a space for children to chase each other between the wooden stalls on bright summer mornings. But now it was nothing more than an empty shell of stone and splintered beams. The frozen fountain at its center cracked and dry, its sculpted figures half buried in snow and ash, and I found myself standing still for a moment, gazing at it and imagining the sound of water trickling there, the laughter of townsfolk echoing off the buildings, the smell of bread and roasted chestnuts drifting through the air. All of it gone now, replaced by the silence of a world that had been stripped of its innocence and warmth. A sudden cough behind me made my heart leap, and I spun around to see an elderly man emerging from the shadows, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a tattered overcoat, his beard long and white but matted with dirt, and his eyes bright yet sunken as though lit by a small flame that had somehow survived years of wind and darkness. And he approached me without fear, stopping only when we were a few paces apart, his voice low and rough like gravel as he asked what I was doing here. His words thick with an accent I couldn't quite place, perhaps Eastern European, and though I hesitated for a moment, I told him the truth, or at least, as much truth as I dared, that I had simply been walking, that I had nowhere else to be, and that I was looking for somewhere to rest until morning. He studied me for a long while as though weighing my words against some silent measure known only to him, and then he nodded slowly, gesturing for me to follow. And I did, trailing him through a narrow passage between 2 leaning buildings, where the wind whistled like a distant train, and the snow lay in deep drifts that crunched under our feet, until at last we reached a small, half-collapsed house at the end of the lane, its windows boarded, its roof patched with sheets of tin, and he ducked inside without ceremony, holding the door open, just long enough for me to slip through before shutting it tight behind us, the sudden warmth of a hidden fire brushing against my face like the ghost of summer. Inside, the place was dim but not unwelcoming, the flickering fire in the hearth casting golden shadow across the walls, where shelves of mismatched books leaned like tired soldiers against each other, and in the far corner a woman sat mending a blanket, her head lifting slightly at our arrival before she offered a faint smile and returned to her work. And the old man motioned for me to sit near the fire, which I did, feeling the heat seep into my frozen fingers while the smell of boiling cabbage drifted from a pot that hung over the flames. And for a long while no one spoke, the crackle of the wood and the low whistle of the wind outside filling the silence, like an unspoken agreement that words could wait until they were needed. When he finally did speak again, the old man asked if I was a soldier, and though I shook my head, I could tell from the way his eyes narrowed that he didn't entirely believe me, but he didn't press, instead leaning back in his chair and telling me that the war had made liars of everyone, that sometimes lies were safer than truths, and that if I wanted to stay here for the night, I would be welcome to do so provided I caused no trouble. and I assured him that trouble was the last thing I wanted. And as the firelight danced on the walls and the cabbage stew thickened in its pot, I felt for the first time in many days that perhaps I had found a place where the war's claws could not quite reach, at least not for a single night. The damp chill of the morning still clung to your coat as you stepped out from the shadows of the safe house and into the fractured light of dawn. The streets of the small French town stretching ahead like veins leading toward an uncertain heart, cobblestones slick from the night, rain reflecting pale shards of sunlight that filtered through the thinning mist, and as you walked, you felt the subtle shifting of the war beneath your feet, the way the sounds of distant artillery, the low hum of military trucks, and the occasional sharp bark of orders in German formed an uneasy chorus that spoke of the occupation's iron grip tightening around the town, each moment reminding you that survival here was not a passive act, but a constant careful dance along the knife's edge between resistance and capture. The woman who had met you in the alley the night before had vanished as swiftly as she had appeared. Her final words, "They will come for the radios at dawn," still echoing in your mind as you approached the edge of the marketplace, where a handful of stalls were beginning to stir to life under the watchful eyes of two German soldiers who stood with rifles slung casually across their shoulders, their casualness itself a performance designed to mask the tension coiled beneath their postures. The way predators appear still before the strike, and you lowered your gaze, moving past them with the deliberate calm of someone who belonged here, whose life was defined not by espionage, but by the everyday. Burdens of bread, milk, and whatever scraps could be bartered in a world where scarcity was as pervasive as the war itself. Turning a corner, you found yourself in the narrow lane that led to the back of the old carpenter's shop, a place that, to anyone passing, looked like little more than a dusty relic of the pre-war world, its windows clouded with age and its door leaning slightly on its hinges. But you knew that behind those worn walls lay one of the most dangerous secrets in the region of shortwave radio. Its fragile circuitry painstakingly hidden within a hollowed workbench, a lifeline between the resistance fighters scattered across the countryside and the British agents who listened on the other side of the channel. And as you slipped inside, you were greeted by the familiar scent of sawdust, damp timber, and the faint metallic temps of solder. The old man behind the counter glancing up from his work with eyes that held both welcome and worry. He said nothing at first, merely nodding toward the back room where the radio was kept, and as you entered, you could feel the static tension in the air, the kind that came when the airwaves were about to carry dangerous words across hostile territory, and the operator, a thin, sharp-eyed youth, barely out of his teens, adjusted the dials with practiced precision, his fingers moving over the controls as if the machine were an extension of his own body, and he glanced up at you briefly, his expression a mixture of relief and urgency, before leaning toward the microphone and speaking in the clipped, coded phrases that meant nothing to an outsider, but could decide the fate of dozens of lives if intercepted. While he transmitted, you stood by the narrow window, peering through the cracked shutters at the street beyond, your heart tightening as you noticed a black staff car rolling slowly into view, the gleaming Wehrmacht insignia on its door catching the morning light like a shard of ice, and behind it, two motorcycles followed in close formation, their riders scanning the buildings with eyes that seemed to strip away walls and secrets. And you realized with a cold sinking certainty that the warning from the woman last night had not been a distant threat but an imminent reality. The Germans were indeed searching for radios, and they had chosen this street to begin their hunt. You turned back to the operator, your voice low but edged with urgency, telling him to finish the message and hide the equipment, and he nodded, his hands quickening on the controls as the old man moved toward a hidden compartment beneath the workbench, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight, the sounds blending with the faint hiss of the radio signal as it carried its last coded words into the ether. And then, with one final twist of a dial, the operator cut the transmission, the room falling into a silence that seemed unnaturally loud, filled only by the muffled roar of engines outside. The three of you moved in quiet, efficient synchrony, wrapping the radio in layers of cloth and wood shavings to mask its shape, sliding it into the hollow space, and pulling the false panel shut just as the heavy thud of boots approached the door, the sound reverberating through the shop like the beat of an approaching drum. and in that moment you felt the weight of the war press down harder than ever. A reminder that in this world every second was a choice between concealment and exposure, between life and the slow, grinding machinery of the Gestapo. The door swung open, the soldiers stepping inside with that mixture of arrogance and precision that came from knowing they held power over every breath you took, their eyes sweeping the room with the cold efficiency of men who had searched countless others like it, their boots scattering curls of wood and dust as one of them began tapping along the walls, listening for the hollow sound that might betray hidden spaces, while another moved toward the back room, his gaze falling briefly on you before lingering on the workbench, and you felt the air grow heavier, the kind of stillness that comes in the split second before a decision that could change the course of your life entirely. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, but the air still held the damp heaviness of a world soaked through, and as I stepped outside into the narrow alleyway that led toward the market, the cobblestones glistened like black glass beneath the weak dawn light that filtered through the overcast sky, each footstep sending a muted splash against my worn boots, the sound almost too loud in the stillness of a town that seemed to be holding its breath, for in the distance faint and intermittent came the low rumble of artillery that reminded everyone that the war was not far away, no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise, and the people I passed moved with a strange, tense energy, glancing over their shoulders more than ahead, carrying baskets and sacks as if they weighed more than their contents, as though the invisible burden of fear pressed them down. I walked past the baker's shop, where the window glass was fogged from the inside, and the smell of fresh bread drifted into the cold morning air, a smell so comforting that it almost hurt, because it belonged to another life, one before air raid sirens and curfews and the sight of soldiers on every street corner, and the baker himself. A broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and flour dust clinging to his apron, was handing a small loaf to a woman clutching the hand of her young son, and though he tried to smile, there was something brittle in it, something that broke the moment she turned away. Further down the street, near the square where a stone fountain stood dry and cracked, I noticed two soldiers in long grey coats leaning against the wall of the post office, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, talking in low voices and occasionally glancing toward the people passing by, their expressions unreadable, but the way the crowd gave them a wide berth told me all I needed to know about the atmosphere here, about the silent lines that had been drawn between us and them, lines you crossed only once, and usually not by choice. I kept my head down as I made my way to the far side of town where an old warehouse loomed, its brick walls scarred by shrapnel, the roof patched with mismatched sheets of tin, and as I approached, I saw a figure slip through a narrow side door, pausing just long enough to look both ways before disappearing inside, and something about the furtive movement made my pulse quicken, for I recognized the man as Victor, a dock worker I had met only once before during a delivery, a man who had spoken little, but whose eyes had seemed to weigh every word I said, and without entirely knowing why, I found myself following him. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil, and the dim light from the grimy windows revealed stacks of crates, some marked with shipping stencils, others bare, and I could hear voices coming from deeper within, muffled but urgent, and as I crept closer, stepping carefully to avoid loose boards, I caught fragments of conversation words like shipment, safe route, and tonight, and though I didn't yet understand their meaning, the tone was unmistakable. This was not ordinary business. This was the kind of talk that, if overheard by the wrong ears, could end in prison or worse. Peering around the edge of a stack of crates, I saw them gathered in a loose circle. Victor, two other men I didn't recognize, and a woman with dark hair pulled back beneath a scarf, her posture straight, her eyes sharp, and it was she who seemed to be leading the conversation, her hands moving as she spoke, drawing lines in the air that I imagined to be maps, and from the way the others listened, I knew she was someone important, someone trusted, perhaps even feared. I realized then that I was seeing something dangerous, something I shouldn't be a part of, yet before I could step back, my boots scuffed against the floor, the sound loud enough to turn 4 pairs of eyes toward me in unison, and in that moment the warehouse felt suddenly much smaller, the air heavier, the path back to the door impossibly far, and the woman's voice cut through the silence with calm precision as she said, "You've been listening." The night seemed to have drawn its last breath as the first faint streaks of pale blue began to creep across the horizon. Yet inside the small farmhouse on the outskirts of the village, the air was still thick with the scent of damp earth, burnt wood, and the faint tank of oil from the lamp that had been burning through most of the dark hours, and you sat hunched over the table with the others, your hands still curled loosely around the chipped enamel mug that had long since lost its warmth, while across from you, Marta was carefully folding the last of the bandages, her fingers quick and practiced, though the deep shadows under her eyes betrayed how little rest she had managed to steal in the past 2 days, and every so often she would glance toward the shuttered window, listening for sounds beyond the steady patter of rain on the roof. The old man Jacob sat beside the fireplace with his back stiff and his gaze fixed on the flames, his jaw working slowly as though chewing over some thought he could not quite bring himself to speak aloud. And near the door, Emil leaned against the wall, the strap of his rifle slung across his chest, his eyes half closed, but his fingers tapping restlessly against the wood, the rhythm slow and steady like a clock counting down towards some inevitable hour. And though no one said it outright, you all knew that soon, perhaps before the day had truly woken you, would have to leave this place, because the enemy patrols had been sighted just 3 kilometers away, and with each passing hour they would be tightening their grip on the roads, the river crossings, and the narrow footpaths that wound between the hedgerows. When the knock came, it was not loud, but it was enough to jolt every head toward the door, and for a heartbeat the only sound was the rain, a steady whisper. Before Emil moved, pushing himself away from the wall with a deliberate slowness, his eyes sharp now, his hand resting on the rifle's grip as he crossed the floor, each step muffled against the worn rug, and you could feel your own heartbeat quicken, your breath tightening as though the air itself had grown heavier, because knocks in these times rarely brought good news and often came with the kind of trouble that left little room for hesitation. Emil's voice was low and firm as he asked the single word, "Who?" and from the other side came an answer in a voice you did not recognize. But it spoke the name of someone Marta knew, because she rose swiftly, setting aside the bandages and moving toward the door with a speed that seemed born of equal parts hope and fear, and when she unlatched it, the wind rushed in first, carrying with it the cold scent of wet fields and smoke, followed by the figure of a man whose coat was soaked through, his boots caked with mud, his face drawn and pale beneath the brim of his cap. He stepped inside without waiting for invitation, glancing once toward you before fixing his gaze on Jacob, and his words came quickly, almost tumbling over one another in his urgency. He had seen the convoy. He said trucks and motorcycles and an armored car heading down the main road, stopping only long enough to question anyone they found, and among them was someone the old man would remember, someone who had once worn the same uniform as Jacob long ago, but now served under the black insignia of the enemy, a man known for his sharp memory and sharper cruelty, and if he reached the village before you moved, it would not end well. Jacob's eyes did not blink for a long moment, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as though to anchor himself against some unseen pull, and then he rose, slow but certain, crossing to the table where the small bundle of supplies waited, his voice steady as he told you and Emil to be ready within the next 10 minutes, because the road north through the orchards would be the only way left before the cordon closed completely, and though the rain would make the ground heavy, it might also hide your tracks. As you began to gather what little you could carry, the sense of finality pressed in from all sides, the knowledge that once you stepped out that door, the safety such as it was that the farmhouse had given you would be gone, replaced by the open uncertainty of fields, woods, and the thin hope of staying one step ahead of the war that seemed to be spreading faster than anyone could run. And somewhere deep inside you felt the truth of it settled. This was not just about survival anymore, but about carrying something forward through the storm, something the war could not so easily crush. The morning broke with a strange stillness that did not belong to this war-torn countryside, the kind of hush that made every creak of the floorboards and every faint rustle of the wind feel like a whispered warning. And as I stepped outside the farmhouse where we had taken shelter, the air smelled faintly of wet soil and smoke, a mingling of life and destruction that had become the signature scent of this strange new reality I had been thrown into. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled once, a deep and lonely sound that carried through the mist like a lament for all that had been lost. I could see them thin columns of soldiers trudging along the muddy road, their silhouettes blurred by the fog, their helmets low over tired eyes, rifles slung loosely against weary shoulders, and they did not look at me as they passed, as though my presence here was something too strange to acknowledge, and I wondered if they thought I was just another displaced villager clinging to the edge of survival, or if perhaps they somehow sensed that I was something else entirely, someone whose arrival had not been written into the history they knew. From inside the farmhouse, the old man emerged again, his coat buttoned up to his chin, and he carried in his hands a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, which he held out to me without a word, and when I opened it I found bread still warm from the hearth, a small wedge of hard cheese, and a folded scrap of paper with writing in a language I didn't fully understand, though the way it was pressed into my palm made it feel less like a note and more like a piece of fate being handed down. We walked together to the edge of the lane where the soldiers had passed, and as we stood there he pointed toward the eastern horizon where the fog was beginning to thin, revealing a line of tall, dark trees and the suggestion of a road cutting through them. And in his eyes was the kind of urgency that needed no translation. There was something I had to see, something waiting out there in that grey forest that would not wait forever. And so, with the bundle under my arm and the sound of my boots crunching in the frosted grass, I set out. The forest closed around me quickly, swallowing the pale morning light, and the silence here was deeper, heavier, as though every tree carried the memory of something it could not tell. And it was only when I had been walking for nearly an hour that I heard the faint, rhythmic thud of metal striking metal, a hammer's song echoing through the woods, pulling me forward until I broke into a small clearing where an old rail line cut a scar through the earth. And there on the track sat a half-repaired train car, its flanks scarred by bullet holes, and beside it a man in oil-stained overalls worked with a stubborn patience that seemed almost out of place in this restless world. When he saw me, he did not ask who I was or why I had come. He simply stepped back from his work and gestured toward the open door of the car, and inside I could see crates stacked high, their sides stenciled with markings in blocky black letters. And though I could not read them fully, I knew enough to understand that whatever was inside was not meant for open eyes, and the air in that dim compartment was thick with the scent of oil, metal, and something faintly chemical. Like the future of the war itself was being kept here, hidden away in this forgotten corner of the forest. I took a step inside, feeling the floor shift faintly under my weight, and as I reached out to touch one of the crates, I noticed something strange, a faint ticking sound, steady and deliberate, coming from deep within, and in that instant my mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last, until the man in the overalls placed a hand on my shoulder and shook his head slowly. Not in warning, but in resignation, as though he had seen this moment coming for a long time. He motioned for me to follow him again, away from the car, down a narrow path that led deeper into the trees, and I went, my thoughts heavy with the unanswered questions that seemed to multiply with every step I took. And though the road ahead was hidden by shadows, I felt that whatever waited at its end was already shaping the story I had fallen into, bending it towards something I could neither predict nor escape. The train that had carried us across so much of a fractured Europe was gone now, swallowed by the night and the smoke that clung to the rail yard like a ghost unwilling to leave, and we stood in the dim light of the station's single flickering lamp, with our breath turning white in the cold air, the rails stretching away into darkness in both directions like veins into the heart of a giant we could not yet see. And somewhere far off the low thud of artillery rolled across the distance like slow, angry thunder, a reminder that every step forward carried us deeper into the war's hungry mouth. Yet there was no question of turning back because the idea of retreat felt more dangerous than the danger ahead, as if going back would unravel the thread of everything we had endured just to get here. I could feel the others' tension in the way they moved, shoulders hunched, heads turning too often, hands lingering too close to coat pockets where pistols and knives might be hidden, and the air smelled of coal, dust, and machine oil, a metallic tenth that stuck to the tongue. and as we began to walk toward the shadowed edge of the station, I became aware of the fact that the streets here were not entirely empty. 4 figures moved in the gloom with a quick darting caution of rats, their eyes reflecting just enough light to suggest life. But whether that life was friend-foe, or something in between, was impossible to tell, and so we walked without speaking, our footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones, as if the city itself wished us to remain unheard. The first checkpoint came sooner than I expected. A crude barricade of sandbags and wire thrown across the street, with 2 soldiers standing watch, their uniforms dark and heavy, faces half hidden under steel helmets, one of them smoking a cigarette that glowed like a single ember in the darkness. And when they saw us, they straightened, rifles shifting just slightly, the motion casual but sharp enough to make my pulse quicken, and I could hear the scrape of boots behind me as Emil and Carla adjusted their pace. The subtle choreography of people who knew they might have to run, fight, or talk their way out in the next few seconds. And when the soldier's voice came, it was rough and short, the sound of someone used to being obeyed without question. I stepped forward before the others could, producing the forged papers we had been given back in the safe house 2 nights ago, the ink still faintly smelling of solvent, and I handed them over with the kind of casual indifference I had been told was key to passing any inspection. As though these documents had been checked 100 times before, and would be checked 100 times more without incident. And I held my breath as the soldier flipped them open, his eyes scanning slowly, the ember of his cigarette flaring brighter for a moment before he grunted and passed them back, his gaze lingering on me just long enough for the skin between my shoulder blades to itch with the certainty that he knew more than he was saying. And then he waved us through with a flick of his gloved hand, turning away before we were even past the barricade. Once we were clear, Emil let out a breath that steamed in the cold air and muttered something in Czech that I didn't understand, but whose meaning I could guess from the tone. And Carla shot him a look that was equal parts warning and relief. And the street ahead opened into a narrow square where the broken windows of shuttered shops reflected the faint light of a waning moon. And I realized that this place, like so many we had passed through, was neither fully alive nor fully dead, existed in that strange in-between space, where war had taken almost everything, but left just enough for people to cling to the idea that life might someday return to normal, though no one could say when or how. In the far corner of the square, a door opened just wide enough for a man's face to appear, his eyes darting over us before he stepped back and beckoned quickly, and without speaking we crossed to him, the sound of our boots echoing against the stone as if urging us to hurry. And inside the building the air was warmer but heavy with the smell of damp wood and old food. And he led us through a maze of narrow hallways to a back room, lit by a single candle where a map was spread across a scarred table, and several men and women stood studying it with the quiet intensity of people who had no time to waste, their faces sharp in the flickering light, their clothes plain, but their eyes alive with a kind of fire that made me feel both out of place and suddenly very certain that whatever came next, there was no turning away from it now. You stand at the edge of the ruins where once the city square bustled with life, the sun setting in a soft blaze of gold over the broken rooftops and fractured streets. The air filled with the scent of dust and faint smoke, but also with the promise of spring carried on a gentle breeze. And as you watch the people move among the rubble, some rebuilding walls, some carrying bricks, some simply sitting on makeshift benches to talk about what was and what will be, you realize that the war you woke up into has finally become the war you have lived through, survived, and seen to its close. And now you stand among them not as a stranger from another time, but as someone who has been shaped and worn by the same currents that wore away the edges of this place. The flags that once hung in fear now hang in pride, sewn together from scraps of cloth, and the children who once hid in cellars now run in the streets again, their laughter strange and bright against the quiet that has settled over the town like a blessing. And as you walk forward you hear people greeting you by name, a name that in your own time had no meaning here, but in this time has become a name spoken with familiarity and gratitude. And it strikes you how war has a way of creating families out of strangers and stories out of survival, until the two are the same thing. You wander the streets you once crept through in silence, now alive with the sound of carpenters' hammers, merchants unpacking crates of goods not seen for years, and the chatter of plans for tomorrow, a word that once felt fragile here but now feels solid beneath your feet. And you can help but think of the first night you awoke in this world, when the sky thundered with distant guns and every shadow felt like the end, and how far you have walked from that moment to this. Each step another thread in a story you never asked to enter, but one you will never forget. And though you know that someday, perhaps without warning, you may open your eyes again and find yourself back in the bed where this strange journey began, back in the familiar hum of a world that never knew these streets or these people, you also know that a part of you will remain here, forever wandering these roads, forever watching the sun rise over rooftops, patched with hope, forever remembering the feeling of surviving alongside those who refuse to give in to despair. So now, as the bells of the rebuilt church toll in the evening light, and the scent of fresh bread drifts from the ovens of a bakery that somehow endured both bombs and hunger, you take one last deep breath of this place, this chapter of your life, and carry it with you, because war may have been the reason you woke here, but it is the peace-hard one that will be the reason you remember it. And to you, dear listener, who has walked every step of this journey with me, from the first bewildering moments of waking in a world at war to this fragile dawn of peace, I want to thank you for being here. If you enjoyed traveling through history's shadows and its flickers of light, please subscribe so you can join me again when we step into new stories like this one and those still waiting to be told. And don't forget to like this video, share it with others who might find comfort in these long winding tales, and leave a comment below to tell me what moments stayed with you most, because I read them all and they keep this channel alive. And when this video ends, you can find more journeys waiting in the previous videos on this channel, ready to carry you to other places, other times, and maybe, just maybe, help you drift into the kind of sleep where dreams feel as vivid as the worlds we've walked together.